in the gilded ballroom where my father celebrated his retirement. Champagne flutes clinked and speeches soared about dedication and legacy. I never imagined that beneath the celebration lay a calculated ultimatum that would shatter everything I believed about unconditional love. The crystal chandeliers cast warm light across the banquet hall as my father, David Sharma, stood at the podium with the confidence of a man who had spent 35 years climbing the ranks of municipal government. His retirement party was everything you would expect from someone who understood the theater of success. Catered appetizers that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, a jazz quartet playing softly in the corner, and colleagues who spoke about his legacy with the reverence typically reserved for statesmen. I adjusted the sleeve of my navy blazer and smiled as he began his speech, genuinely proud of the man who had worked 16-hour days to provide for our family after my mother's death when I was 12. The woman beside him, my stepmother Linda, beamed with the satisfaction of someone who had successfully orchestrated an event worthy of social media documentation. My half-sister Rachel stood nearby, her phone already recording what she undoubtedly planned to transform into content for her lifestyle brand. At 28, I had carved out what I considered a successful life in software development. My apartment in the tech district was modest, but my career trajectory was promising, and for the first time since childhood, I felt the intoxicating freedom of financial independence. The journey from my father's house to my own had been methodical. College graduation with honors, entry-level programming position, promotions earned through late nights and weekend projects, and finally, the apartment lease I signed with pride 3 years earlier. The evening's first warning sign came during dinner, when Linda leaned across the table and commented on my recent promotion with a smile that never reached her eyes. "It must be nice to have so much extra money now," she said, her voice carrying the subtle edge that had characterized our relationship since her arrival in our family 6 years earlier. "I hope you remember where you came from." Rachel, now 21 and perpetually between academic pursuits, nodded in agreement while updating her Instagram story. Her latest venture involved something she called intentional living, which appeared to consist primarily of yoga poses on expensive mats and philosophical quotes overlaid on sunset photographs. The irony of someone preaching intentional living while being entirely supported by others was not lost on me, though I kept this observation to myself in the interest of family harmony. My father's speech began conventionally enough. He thanked his colleagues, acknowledged his achievements, and spoke about the satisfaction of public service. The audience responded with appropriate applause, and I found myself relaxing into what I assumed would be a pleasant evening of celebration. Then his tone shifted, becoming more serious, more personal. "Throughout my career, I have believed in the principle of reciprocity," he said, his voice carrying the authority that had served him well in municipal meetings. "When we invest in others, we have the right to expect returns on that investment. When we sacrifice for family, we create bonds that extend beyond sentiment into responsibility." The room grew quieter, the casual conversation at nearby tables diminishing as guests sensed the gravity in his words. I felt a strange unease settling in my stomach, though I could not yet articulate why. Now that I have entered retirement, it is time for those I have invested in most deeply to demonstrate their commitment to the family unit. Effective immediately, each of my adult children will contribute 30% of their monthly income to support our household. This is not a request, but an expectation, rooted in fairness and the natural order of family obligation. The silence that followed felt infinite. Then, as if released from a spell, the room erupted in applause. Guests who barely knew our family dynamics clapped enthusiastically, apparently moved by what they perceived as a heartwarming example of intergenerational support. Linda's applause was particularly vigorous, her eyes bright with vindication. Rachel's smile held a smugness that suggested she had been anticipating this moment for some time. I remained motionless in my chair, processing words that seemed to belong in a different conversation, a different universe. The logical part of my mind insisted this was an elaborate joke the kind of awkward humor my father occasionally employed at family gatherings. Yet the formality of his presentation, the prepared nature of his remarks, and the supportive reactions around me suggested otherwise. My father reached into his jacket and withdrew 2 sealed envelopes, each bearing a name written in his precise handwriting. One bore my name, the other my older brother Eric's. The weight of the moment pressed down on me as he approached our table, his expression serious and expectant. Inside my envelope, printed on official letterhead from his home office, was a document that defied belief. The contract, for that was clearly what it represented, outlined my new financial obligations with bureaucratic precision. Monthly contribution, 30% of gross income. Payment method, automatic bank transfer. Effective date, immediate. Bank routing information, provided. Legal language, intimidating despite its dubious validity. The absurdity of the situation competed with a growing sense of violation. This was not a conversation or a negotiation. It was a unilateral declaration of control over my adult life, presented publicly to eliminate any possibility of private dissent. The theater of the retirement party now revealed its true purpose. Not celebration, but coercion disguised as family tradition. "You cannot be serious," I said, my voice barely audible above the continued murmur of approval from nearby tables. The document trembled slightly in my hands as the full implications settled in. 30% of my salary would effectively eliminate my savings, compromise my independence, and reduce me to a tributary in my father's economic empire. His response carried the weight of absolute certainty. I have never been more serious about anything in my life. For 28 years, I provided everything you needed: food, shelter, education, opportunities. I never asked for anything in return. But now it is your turn to contribute to the family's welfare. This is how functional families operate. I looked desperately toward Linda, hoping to find some sign that she recognized the unreasonableness of the demand. Instead, I found her sipping wine with the satisfaction of someone watching a long-awaited vindication unfold. Her expression suggested that this moment represented the culmination of years of careful planning and patient manipulation. Rachel's reaction was perhaps the most painful. The sister I had tried to mentor and support despite our age difference was regarding me with undisguised satisfaction, as if my discomfort validated some grievance she had harbored in silence. Her smile held the cruelty of someone who believed they were witnessing justice rather than extortion. The room seemed to close in around me as I realized that everyone present expected me to accept this arrangement with gratitude. The weight of cultural expectations, family loyalty, and public pressure created a suffocating atmosphere that demanded compliance. Yet something deeper than social convention was rebelling inside me, a voice insisting that love should not come with such calculated terms. Without allowing myself time to reconsider, I stood slowly and deliberately. The conversation at nearby tables quieted as attention focused on my response. With movements that felt both ceremonial and defiant, I took the contract in both hands and tore it cleanly down the middle. The sound of ripping paper seemed disproportionately loud in the suddenly silent room. I placed the torn pieces carefully on the table beside my untouched dessert, straightened my blazer, and walked toward the exit with as much dignity as I could muster. Behind me, I could hear the rising murmur of shocked conversation and Linda's voice calling my name with theatrical distress. I did not turn around. The morning after brought 46 missed calls, a number that seemed both excessive and somehow insufficient to capture the magnitude of the family crisis I had apparently created. The voicemails ranged from my father's controlled anger to Linda's emotional manipulation to Rachel's self-righteous lectures about family loyalty and gratitude. Each message reinforced my growing understanding that the previous evening's events had been neither spontaneous nor isolated. My brother Eric's call provided the first rational perspective on the situation. His voice carried the exhaustion of someone who had spent the night processing his own version of the same ultimatum, delivered via certified mail to his home in Seattle. As a data analyst with a mortgage and 2 young children, the demand for 30% of his income represented not just an inconvenience, but a genuine threat to his family's financial stability. "They sent this like it was a job offer," he said, his usual calm demeanor strained with frustration, complete with legal language and bank routing information. "This isn't about helping the family. It's about replacing his income with ours. Rachel lives rent-free. Linda hasn't worked in years, and now they want us to subsidize their lifestyle indefinitely." His analysis cut through the emotional manipulation to reveal the practical reality of the situation. My father's retirement had created a gap in household income that he intended to fill by transforming his adult children into unwilling financial contributors. The cultural language about family obligation and reciprocity served as a veneer over what was essentially economic coercion. The afternoon brought an unexpected development. My father and Rachel appeared at my apartment door, having somehow obtained access to the building despite my not buzzing them in. Linda remained in the car, perhaps recognizing that her presence would only inflame an already volatile situation. Rachel entered my apartment with the entitlement of someone who had never learned to respect boundaries, immediately positioning herself in my living room as if preparing for a confrontation she had been rehearsing. My father's demeanor was different from the previous evening, less theatrical, more businesslike, suggesting that he viewed this as a negotiation rather than a family discussion. "This is not punishment," he began, his voice carrying the reasonable tone he had perfected during decades of municipal meetings. "This is fairness. You and Eric have benefited from years of investment. Your stepmother has maintained our household and supported Rachel during her period of self-discovery. It is time for you to acknowledge your obligations and contribute to the family unit." The language was carefully chosen to frame resistance as selfishness and compliance as maturity. Yet the underlying assumption that my adult life remained subject to his approval and direction struck me as fundamentally incompatible with the independence I had worked so hard to achieve. "I am not a child anymore," I replied, struggling to keep my voice level. "My salary is the result of my work, my education, and my choices. You do not get to dictate how I spend money I have earned through my own efforts." His response revealed the deeper philosophy underlying his demand. He spoke about filial duty, family legacy, and the shame of children who abandon their responsibilities to pursue individual desires. The words carried the weight of cultural tradition and parental authority, yet they felt increasingly hollow as I recognized the self-serving nature of his moral framework. Rachel's contribution to the conversation proved to be the catalyst that transformed my uncertainty into clarity. "You act like you are so independent," she said, her voice dripping with resentment, "but Dad funded your life. Your apartment, your career, your success. None of that happened in a vacuum. You think you accomplished everything on your own, but you have been living off his investment for years." The accusation was both unfair and revealing. It suggested that any success I had achieved remained, in their view, partially owned by my father, subject to his ongoing claims and expectations. The concept of adult independence seemed foreign to their understanding of family relationships, which appeared to operate more like a business arrangement with perpetual obligations and returns on investment. My response came from a place of hurt and anger that had been building for years beneath the surface of family politeness. "You want a salary? Get a job. I am not replacing Dad's paycheck, so you can do Instagram meditations and call it self-work. And I am not paying for Linda's lifestyle or whatever financial arrangement you have all decided I owe you." The conversation deteriorated from there, with accusations of ingratitude and threats about the consequences of my selfishness. When I asked them to leave, Rachel's parting words confirmed what I had begun to suspect. This confrontation had been inevitable, not because of my actions, but because of their expectations. The legal threats that followed were both absurd and intimidating. My father's attempt to create retroactive billing for my childhood care, complete with itemized expenses and interest calculations, revealed the transactional nature of how he viewed our relationship. The involvement of Linda's cousin, allegedly a lawyer, added a veneer of legitimacy to what Eric's actual attorney quickly identified as legally baseless harassment. Yet, the emotional impact of the campaign that followed was considerable. Extended family members who had never shown interest in my life suddenly felt compelled to share their opinions about Western selfishness and traditional family values. The group chat messages and voice notes created a sense of isolation that was perhaps their intended effect. The turning point came when they appeared at my apartment building late one evening with what appeared to be legal representation, attempting to gain access through intimidation rather than invitation. The violation of that boundary, combined with the realization that their harassment was escalating rather than diminishing, forced me to acknowledge that this situation required professional intervention. The family attorney I consulted provided both legal clarity and emotional validation. The contract was unenforceable, the threats were baseless, and the pattern of behavior constituted harassment. More importantly, she helped me understand that my guilt was misplaced. Parents cannot retroactively charge their children for the costs of childhood care, and adult relationships cannot be governed by contracts signed under duress. The cease and desist letter I authorized marked the end of their direct attempts at coercion, though it also represented the final severance of relationships that had been deteriorating for years beneath the surface of family obligation. The silence that followed was both relief and grief. Relief from the pressure, grief for the family I had hoped we could be. In the weeks that followed, I began to understand that my father's retirement party had not created our family's dysfunction, but merely revealed it. The transactional nature of his love, the conditional quality of his approval, and the way he had weaponized gratitude to maintain control had been present throughout my childhood, though I had lacked the perspective to recognize these patterns. The letter I wrote but never sent captured the essence of what I had learned, that freedom sometimes requires the courage to disappoint people who have mistaken control for care. The realization that I could build my own definition of family, one based on mutual respect rather than financial obligation, marked the beginning of a different kind of independence. The story my father now tells about our estrangement focuses on my ingratitude and misunderstanding, which is perhaps appropriate. Some truths are too threatening to acknowledge by those who benefit from the existing order. Yet I have found peace in my version of events, one that recognizes love as something that cannot be purchased, contracted, or demanded. The relationship with Eric has strengthened through our shared experience, and we have discovered that family bonds can survive the rejection of family dysfunction. The boundaries I have established feel less like walls than like foundations for the life I am building on my own terms. The apartment that once represented simple independence now symbolizes something more profound. The possibility of relationships based on choice rather than obligation, of success that belongs fully to the person who achieved it, and of love that does not come with a bill.